The widow's hands had stopped shaking 3 years ago, but tonight they trembled again. She stood in her kitchen in the dark, listening to the wind push against the walls of the farmhouse. The phone lay on the counter where she'd dropped it. The voice on the other end had been young, too young, a boy's voice cracking at the edges, speaking words she'd memorized in her sleep. "Mama, they know you're coming." Then silence. Then the dial tone that sounded like the end of everything. She'd known this call would come someday. Every mother who leaves her child behind knows. The reckoning arrives in its own time, carried on the breath of seasons, riding the back of patience until patience breaks. For 3 years, she'd built this new life in Montana, in a town so small it didn't exist on some maps. She'd worked at the diner, kept her head down, changed her name from Rebecca to just Becca. No last name needed, no past required. But the past never stays buried in the ground where you leave it. The compound sat 200 miles south, hidden in the Wyoming wilderness, where the mountains meet the high desert. She could still smell it if she closed her eyes. Sage and dust and something else. Something like fear disguised as devotion. The prophet called it sacred ground. The women called it home because they'd forgotten any other word for prison. She'd escaped on a winter night when the snow fell so thick it erased her footprints as fast as she made them. She'd run through the woods with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart that wouldn't stop screaming her son's name. Samuel, 8 years old then, 11 now, old enough to remember her face, old enough to hate her for leaving. The compound had rules about women who left. They became ghosts, erased from memory, burned from photographs. Their children were told they'd never existed, or worse, that they died serving the community in some noble way. Samuel would have been told she was dead. The prophet would have made sure of it. But the boy on the phone had called her Mama, which meant Samuel remembered, which meant the prophet's hold was slipping, which meant someone inside the compound wanted her to know. The wind died suddenly, the way it does before a storm decides to show its true strength. In the silence that followed, she heard her own breathing, shallow and quick. She picked up the phone and set it back in its cradle. Her reflection stared back at her from the kitchen window. A woman of 42 who looked older in the right light, younger in the wrong one. Hair she'd cut short the day after she escaped, now grown back to her shoulders. Brown eyes that used to be bright, now just watchful. The sheriff would tell her not to go. He'd been kind to her these 3 years. In the careful way men are kind to women, they sense are running from something. He'd never asked questions, and she'd never offered answers. But if she told him about the phone call, about Samuel, about the compound, he'd try to stop her. He'd talk about jurisdiction and legal channels and all the slow machinery of the law that would take months and give the prophet time to move the boy somewhere she'd never find him. No, this was hers to do alone. She turned away from her reflection and walked through the house she'd made into something like a home. 2 bedrooms upstairs. One she slept in. One she kept empty but ready, with sheets on the bed and a lamp on the nightstand. Waiting. Always waiting for a son who might someday come home. Tomorrow she would get in her truck and drive south. Tomorrow she would return to the only place on earth she'd sworn never to see again. Tomorrow she would walk back into the mouth of the beast and pull her child out by force if necessary. But tonight she would sit in the dark and remember everything she'd tried so hard to forget. The town of Birch Falls, Montana, had exactly 1 traffic light, 2 churches, and 347 people who mostly kept their business to themselves. Becca had chosen it for exactly those reasons. She'd arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, driving a truck she'd bought with cash in Idaho, carrying nothing that could connect her to who she'd been before. The diner hired her the same day. Nancy, the owner, took one look at her and said, "You run pretty far, honey." Becca had frozen, hand still on the door. Nancy just smiled. "Don't worry. Half the people in this town are running from something. We don't ask, and you don't tell. But you can cook?" She could. The compound had taught her that much. Feed 50 people 3 times a day with whatever the garden provides and the hunters bring back. Make it stretch, make it good, never complain, never ask for seconds, never look the prophet in the eye when he walks through the kitchen to inspect the meal. Those years felt like someone else's life now, but the skills remained. Muscle memory doesn't forget, even when the mind tries to. She'd worked at Nancy's diner 6 days a week for 3 years. She made breakfast at dawn, served lunch at noon, cleaned the kitchen until it shined. The regulars learned her face but not her story. They called her Becca, asked about the weather, left decent tips. On Sundays, she stayed home and worked on the farmhouse she'd rented at the edge of town, painting walls, fixing the porch, planting flowers that would bloom in spring, building a life that felt solid enough to hold her weight. But underneath every moment, underneath every smile and conversation and ordinary day, Samuel lived in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow or spit out. She'd left him behind. That was the truth she carried. The truth that woke her at 3 in the morning and wouldn't let her sleep again. The truth that made her hands shake when she saw boys his age walking to school or playing in the park. The truth that lived in the empty bedroom upstairs, waiting. The prophet had taken her to the compound when she was 19, young and desperate and looking for something to believe in. He'd found her at a bus station in Salt Lake City, crying over a pregnancy test and a boyfriend who disappeared the moment she told him. The prophet had offered salvation, a community, a place where she and her unborn child would be safe and loved and protected from the sinful world outside. She'd believed him because she'd needed to believe something. For 13 years, she'd lived behind those walls. She'd learned the prayers and the rituals. She'd worked in the kitchen and the garden. She'd raised Samuel alongside the other children of the community, watching him grow in a world where the prophet's word was law and questioning meant punishment. She'd watched boys taken for special training. She'd watched girls married off at 16 to men 3 times their age. She'd watched people disappear when they broke the rules or doubted the faith. And she'd stayed. That was the part she couldn't forgive herself for. She'd stayed because leaving meant leaving Samuel, and leaving Samuel meant admitting she'd brought him into hell disguised as heaven. The night she finally ran, something had broken inside her. She'd seen the prophet take a 14-year-old girl into his private quarters. She'd heard the girl's mother praising God for the honor. She'd looked at Samuel, 8 years old, and already starting to speak in the prophet's voice, already learning to watch the women with the same cold evaluation she'd seen in the men's eyes. She'd looked at her son and seen him disappearing into the same darkness that had swallowed all of them. So she'd run. She'd kissed him while he slept, pressed her hand against his forehead, whispered promises she knew she couldn't keep. Then she'd walked out into the snow and run until her lungs burned and her legs gave out, and a truck driver found her collapsed on the highway 20 miles from the compound. He'd taken her to a hospital. The hospital had asked questions. She'd lied, said she'd been hiking and gotten lost, said she had no family to call, said she was fine, just needed rest. They'd let her go after 2 days, and she'd started running again, city to city, state to state. Working cash jobs, sleeping in her truck, always moving until she couldn't feel them following her anymore. Then she'd found Birch Falls and stopped. For 3 years she'd built this small, quiet life. She'd told herself Samuel was better off without her. She'd told herself the prophet would protect him because the prophet needed sons to carry on his vision. She'd told herself 100 lies to make the guilt bearable enough to survive, but she'd never stopped preparing. Never stopped saving money in a coffee can hidden under the floorboards. Never stopped marking the calendar, counting the days until Samuel turned 12. 12 was the age when boys were taken for their manhood trials. 12 was when the prophet broke them, or they broke themselves trying to prove they were worthy. Samuel would be 11 in 3 months. The phone call had come early, but it had come. Now she sat in the dark kitchen of her Montana farmhouse, and she made her plans. She had $2,000 saved. She had a truck with a full tank of gas. She had 3 years of survival skills and a mother's desperate love that felt like a weapon she didn't know how to use. What she didn't have was a plan beyond driving south and seeing what she'd find. The sheriff's truck pulled up outside just before midnight. She heard his boots on the porch, the knock that came soft and uncertain. She opened the door before he could knock again. "Becca?" Sheriff Tom Garrett was 53, grey at the temples, with eyes that had seen too much of people's worst moments. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands. "Saw your lights on. Wanted to make sure everything's all right." "I'm fine." "You look like someone who's about to do something stupid." She almost smiled. "That obvious?" "I've been doing this job 30 years. I know the look." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Whatever it is, let me help." "You can't. Try me." She looked at him, this good man who'd been kind without expecting anything in return. She wanted to tell him, wanted to let someone else carry the weight for just a moment, but the words stuck in her throat. "I have to leave for a few days," she finally said. "Just wanted you to know in case anyone asks." "Where are you going?" "South." "That's a direction, not a destination. It's all I can tell you." He studied her face in the porch light. "This about your boy?" Her heart stopped. How did you—" "I'm a sheriff, Becca. I notice things, like how you watch kids his age, like how you've got a bedroom set up for someone who never visits, like how you flinch every time the phone rings." He put his hat back on. "I don't know where he is or why you're not together, but I know you didn't leave him by choice." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "I have to go get him." "Is it dangerous?" "Yes." "You need backup." "I need to do this alone." He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "When you coming back?" "I don't know." "But you are coming back." She thought about her house, her job, her small life in Birch Falls. 3 years ago, it had been refuge. Now it felt like waiting. "I hope so." "All right then." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card with his cell phone number written on it. "You get in trouble, you call me. Don't care what jurisdiction we're talking about. You call and I'll come." She took the card, throat too tight to speak. "And Becca?" He turned back at the edge of the porch. "Bring him home." She watched his truck disappear down the road, red taillights fading into the Montana darkness. Then she went inside and started packing. Rising tension. The drive south took 12 hours with stops for gas and coffee. Becca drove through the night, watching the landscape change in her headlights. Mountains gave way to high plains. Pine forests thinned into scrubland. The roads grew emptier until she was the only vehicle for miles, alone with her thoughts and the low hum of the engine. She'd memorized the route years ago, even though she'd sworn she'd never use it. The compound sat in a valley 30 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through federal land. The prophet had chosen the location carefully, isolated enough that the outside world wouldn't bother them. remote enough that leaving required planning and courage most people didn't have. She crossed into Wyoming as dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. The beauty of it hurt. She'd forgotten how stunning this country could be when you weren't looking at it through the lens of captivity. By mid-morning, she reached Redemption, Wyoming. Population 412. One main street lined with buildings that looked older than the state itself. A gas station that still had analog pumps. A grocery store with a faded Coca-Cola sign. A post office. A feed store. Nothing else for 60 miles in any direction. She pulled into the gas station and filled the truck, watching the street from behind her sunglasses. 3 years ago, she'd stumbled through this town in the back of that trucker's rig, barely conscious, praying no one from the compound would see her. Now she was back, and the fear tasted the same. The gas station attendant was new. Young kid, maybe 20, with tattoos up both arms and a bored expression. He took her cash and didn't ask questions. She bought a map even though she knew the way, and a bottle of water she didn't want, and a candy bar that would sit in her pocket until it melted. In the truck, she unfolded the map and stared at the area where the compound should be. Nothing marked it officially. Just empty space between roads, labeled as BLM land, Bureau of Land Management. Public property that the prophet had claimed through some legal loophole she'd never understood. He'd filed for religious exemption, called it a church, called it a sanctuary. The government had left them alone as long as they didn't cause trouble. And they never caused trouble. That was the genius of it. The prophet ran his kingdom in silence. No complaints to authorities, no scandals that made the news. People who left either kept quiet out of fear or shame, or they disappeared entirely. The outside world had no idea what happened behind those walls. She drove out of Redemption heading west, following the 2-lane highway until she reached the unmarked turnoff. The dirt road looked the same as she remembered. Rutted and narrow, winding through sagebrush and rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels. No signs, no indication that anything existed at the end of this road except wilderness. She drove slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. Every mile brought back memories she'd tried to bury. That boulder where Samuel had found a lizard and brought it to show her. That bend in the road where she'd twisted her ankle during a group hike. That hillside where the prophet held Easter services, preaching about resurrection, while the women stood in the sun until they fainted. 5 miles in, she saw the first security measure. A camera mounted on a pole, disguised to look like a birdhouse. She'd helped install similar ones years ago, part of the prophet's paranoia about outsiders finding them. The cameras fed to a security room where young men watched monitors 12 hours at a time, recording every vehicle that approached. They'd seen her truck by now. They'd be watching. She kept driving, no point in turning back. The road climbed into hills covered in juniper and pinon pine. The valley opened ahead, and there it was. The compound. From this distance it looked almost peaceful. A collection of buildings arranged around a central courtyard, wooden structures painted white, with gardens and orchards spread across 20 acres, solar panels on the roofs catching morning light, children playing near the chicken coops, women hanging laundry, men working in the fields. It looked like a postcard of simple living, like a place people would pay to visit on spiritual retreats. She knew better. She parked her truck on a ridge overlooking the valley, 1/2 mile from the main gate, close enough to see, far enough to avoid immediate attention. She pulled out binoculars from her bag and started scanning the compound, looking for changes. The main building still dominated the center. That was the prophet's house, where he lived with his 3 wives and held private audiences with his inner circle. The chapel sat beside it, with the bell tower where they'd ring 3 times a day for prayer, the dining hall where everyone ate together, the school building where children learned scripture instead of science, and there, at the far edge of the compound, the dormitory where the boys lived after they turned 8. That's where Samuel would be. She adjusted the binoculars, trying to find him in the group of children near the chicken coops. Too far to see faces clearly, but she could make out sizes and shapes. 3 boys, roughly the right age, all wearing the compound uniform, dark pants, white shirts, suspenders. The prophet liked his followers to look humble and uniform. Individuality was vanity. Vanity was sin. Which one was Samuel? She watched for 2 hours, tracking the boys as they moved through their morning routines, feeding animals, hauling water, working in the garden under the supervision of older men. The pattern was familiar. The prophet believed in labor as prayer. Idle hands served the devil. Every child old enough to walk was old enough to work. At noon the bell rang for lunch. The compound emptied into the dining hall. She saw figures streaming from all directions, men and women and children flowing into the building like a tide. For 20 minutes the compound stood empty except for 2 guards at the main gate. Then they emerged again, and she finally saw him. Samuel. She knew him instantly, even through the binoculars, even after 3 years. The way he walked with his shoulders slightly hunched, like he was trying to make himself smaller. The way he kept his eyes down, the way he stayed at the back of the group, separate even while surrounded by others. Her son, alive, taller, older, but alive. The binoculars shook in her hands. She lowered them and pressed her palms against her eyes, breathing through the wave of emotion that threatened to break her. 3 years of not knowing if he was okay. If he'd forgotten her, if they'd hurt him for being her son. He was alive. That was enough to restart her heart. But watching him move through the compound, head down, shoulders hunched, she saw what 3 years had done. He'd learned to make himself invisible. He'd learned the survival skills she'd taught him without meaning to. Disappear into the background. Don't draw attention. Don't give them a reason to notice you. He was surviving. But survival wasn't living. She stayed on the ridge until sunset, memorizing the compound's patterns. Guard shifts changed at 6. Dinner bell rang at 7. Evening prayer at 8. Lights out at 9. The schedule hadn't changed in 3 years. The prophet liked routine. Routine made people predictable. Predictable people were easier to control. As darkness fell, she drove back to Redemption and checked into the town's only motel. The clerk was elderly, hard of hearing, and uninterested in conversation. Perfect. She paid cash for 3 nights and asked for a room at the back. The room smelled of dust and disinfectant, a bed with a thin mattress, a TV that only got 2 channels, a bathroom with rust stains in the sink. She sat on the bed and stared at her phone. The call had come from inside the compound. Someone had helped Samuel reach a phone. Someone wanted her to come back. But who? She thought through the women she'd known. Most were true believers, devoted to the prophet and his vision. But there had been others. Women like her, who'd arrived desperate and stayed trapped. Women who whispered doubts in the dark after the men had gone to sleep. Women who cried quietly so no one would hear. Ruth had been her closest friend in the compound. A woman 10 years older who'd lost 2 children to illness and blamed herself for not praying hard enough. Ruth had watched Becca's escape with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. The next morning, Ruth had reported that Becca's bed was empty, her coat was missing, and she must have wandered into the woods during the night. No one had suspected Ruth of helping. Could Ruth have made the call happen? It was possible. Ruth worked in the administration building, handling the compound's few external communications. She'd have access to a phone. She'd know when the security room was lightly staffed. She'd know Samuel well enough to convince him that his mother was still alive. But why now? Why after 3 years of silence? Becca lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd need a plan better than just showing up at the gate and demanding her son. The prophet didn't negotiate with apostates. Women who left the compound were considered dead to the community. She had no legal rights to Samuel anymore. The prophet had seen to that, filing papers that named him as Samuel's guardian after her death from exposure in the wilderness. She'd checked once, 2 years ago, calling a lawyer from a payphone. The lawyer had explained that cults were hard to prosecute unless there was clear evidence of abuse, unless someone was willing to testify, unless children were in immediate danger. The authorities couldn't do much. Religious freedom protected even the worst manipulation, as long as it stayed behind closed doors, so she'd have to take him, just walk in and take him, or die trying. The thought sat in her stomach like cold iron. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sheriff Garrett. "Made it okay?" she texted back. "Yes. Need anything?" "Not yet, thank you." "Be safe." She set the phone aside and tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes she saw Samuel's hunched shoulders, his downcast eyes, his careful invisibility. She saw him growing up in that place, learning the prophet's lessons, becoming what the prophet wanted him to become, unless she stopped it. At 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and drove back to the ridge overlooking the compound. She parked in the same spot and watched the buildings in darkness. A few lights still burned. The security room, the prophet's house, the infirmary where women went when pregnancy or illness required attention. And then she saw movement. Someone walking across the courtyard alone, small figure, moving quickly but carefully, staying close to the shadows. The person disappeared behind the dining hall, then reappeared near the boys' dormitory. She focused the binoculars. It was a woman. Older, grey hair visible even in the dim light. She stood at the dormitory door, then knocked softly. The door opened. Brief conversation. Then the woman handed something through the door and hurried away. Becca's heart raced. Ruth. It had to be Ruth. Which meant Ruth was still helping, still watching over Samuel, still waiting for Becca to come back. The door to the dormitory closed. The woman disappeared into the shadows. The compound returned to silence. Becca sat in her truck until dawn, forming the beginning of a plan. The next morning she returned to Redemption and walked into the feed store. The owner was a man in his 60s, weathered face, suspicious eyes. He looked up from his counter and studied her without speaking. "Help you?" "Need to buy some supplies, chicken feed, nails, maybe some fencing. You got chickens?" "Thinking about getting some. Heard there's good land around here for small farming." He grunted. "Land's cheap if you don't mind the isolation." "I like isolation." He nodded slowly, still studying her. "You look familiar. You been through here before?" "Maybe a few years back, passing through." "Lot of people pass through. Not many come back." He moved from behind the counter and started pulling items off shelves. "Chickens aren't easy. Need to know what you're doing." "I know." "Learned from experience?" She met his eyes. Something like that. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded like he'd made a decision about something. "There's folks up in the hills, religious community. They keep to themselves mostly. You planning on having anything to do with them?" Her pulse quickened. "Why would I?" "Just asking. They buy supplies here sometimes. Send men down once a month. Always polite, always pay cash, always leave quick, but I hear things." "What kind of things?" He leaned against the counter, voice dropping. "My nephew's a social worker over in Rock Springs. Says they've had complaints about that compound." Parents trying to get their kids back, women saying they were held against their will. But nothing ever sticks. The cult's got lawyers, good ones. They know how to make problems go away. Sounds complicated. Sounds wrong. He looked out the window at the empty street. You know what gets me? The kids. They come down here sometimes with the men, and they don't look right. Too quiet, too well-behaved. Kids should be wild and messy and full of questions. These kids look like little soldiers. Becca's hands tightened on the shopping basket. You ever tried to help them? What am I supposed to do? Call the sheriff. He's been out there. Says everything looks fine. The prophet gives him the tour. Shows him happy families. Quotes scripture about religious freedom. The sheriff can't do anything without evidence of actual crimes. He shook his head. So we watch, and we wait, and we hope nobody gets hurt bad enough that we have to do something. Hope isn't much of a strategy. No, Mom, it's not. He rang up her purchases. You planning on staying in Redemption long? Few days, maybe. Motel's cheap. Food's decent at the diner. And if you need anything else... He paused, weighing his words. If you need anything that might help those kids up in the hills, you come back and see me. Understand? She understood. She understood that resistance existed even in small places like Redemption. She understood that people knew the truth even if they couldn't speak it loudly. She understood that she wasn't alone in wanting to tear down the prophet's kingdom. She just had to figure out how. That afternoon she drove back to the ridge and watched the compound through binoculars again. She mapped the routines in her notebook. Guard rotations, meal times, work schedules, the pattern of daily life that never varied. She watched Samuel every chance she got. He worked in the garden with other boys, pulling weeds and hauling water. He ate lunch at the end of a long table, separate from the other children. He walked to evening prayer with his head down, hands clasped behind his back. He looked lonely. That hurt more than anything else. The knowledge that her son lived surrounded by people but existed in solitude. That he'd learned to protect himself by disappearing. That 3 years without her had taught him the same survival skills she'd used, the same emotional armor. On the third day, she saw the prophet. He emerged from his house at noon, flanked by 2 men she recognized as his inner circle. Elders, he called them. Men who'd proven their devotion through years of service. They wore the same clothes as everyone else, but they carried themselves differently. Straight backs, confident strides, the certainty of men who believed they spoke for God. The prophet was 60 now, grey beard, trimmed neat, eyes like blue ice. He'd been handsome once, in the way that drew young women looking for salvation. Now he just looked like what he was, a man who'd built a kingdom on manipulation and maintained it through fear, disguised as faith. He crossed the courtyard and entered the chapel. 20 minutes later, people began filing in for a special prayer service. Everyone except the children, too young to sit still. They stayed outside with supervised play. Samuel went into the chapel with the other boys his age. Becca watched through the binoculars, hands shaking with rage and helplessness. Her son sitting in that building, listening to the prophet's lies, absorbing the poison that would eventually make him a true believer or break him trying. She couldn't wait any longer. Tonight. It had to be tonight. The plan was simple, because complicated plans required resources she didn't have. Wait until after lights out. Approach from the north side, where the security cameras had blind spots. Cut through the fence behind the boys' dormitory. Find Samuel. Run. If they caught her, she'd fight. If they killed her, at least she'd die trying. She spent the afternoon in her motel room, preparing. She dressed in dark clothes. She packed a backpack with water, food, a first aid kit, and the cash she'd saved. She wrote a letter to Sheriff Garrett, explaining everything, sealed it in an envelope, and left it on the bedside table with instructions to open if she didn't return by morning. Then she drove to the ridge one last time and waited for sunset. The compound lights came on at dusk. She watched the evening routines play out below. Dinner, prayer, clean-up. Children herded into dormitories. Adults returning to their homes, guards taking positions at the gate. By 10 o'clock, most lights were off. By 11, only the security room and Prophet's house still glowed in the darkness. Becca pulled on gloves and checked her backpack one more time. She left her truck hidden in the trees and started walking down the hillside, moving slowly, testing each step before committing her weight. The desert was full of loose rocks that could start a slide. The last thing she needed was noise. It took 30 minutes to reach the compound perimeter. The fence was 8 feet tall, chain-link topped with barbed wire, not meant to keep people out so much as keep people in. She followed the fence line to the north, staying low, pausing every few yards to listen. The blind spot was where she remembered it. A section where 2 cameras' fields of view didn't quite overlap, leaving a gap of maybe 6 feet. She pulled out the wire cutters she'd bought at the feed store and started working on the chain link. Each snip sounded impossibly loud in the desert silence. She worked slowly, stopping to listen after each cut. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Finally, the hole was big enough to crawl through. She pushed her backpack ahead and squeezed through the gap, feeling the torn metal catch on her jacket. On the other side, she crouched in the shadow of a storage shed and caught her breath. The compound stretched ahead of her. Dark buildings, empty paths. The boys' dormitory was 200 yards away, across open ground she'd have to cross without being seen. She waited, watching for guards, counting their patrol patterns. There. One guard walking the perimeter, another stationed at the main gate, a third probably inside the security room watching monitors. The patrol passed her position. She counted to 30, then sprinted across the open ground, keeping low. Her boots made soft sounds on the packed dirt. Her heart hammered loud enough she thought they'd hear it from the security room. She reached the dormitory wall and pressed herself against it, breathing hard. The building was dark, silent. She moved along the wall to the back door, the one she'd seen Ruth knock on. The door was locked. Of course it was locked. She pulled out a screwdriver and worked the lock the way a woman at a shelter in Idaho had taught her. It took 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. Then the lock clicked and the door swung open. Inside was darkness and the smell of sleeping children. Bunks lined the walls. 20 beds, maybe more. She could hear breathing, soft snores, the shift of someone dreaming. She crept between the bunks, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Faces appeared in the dim light from the windows. Boys between 8 and 14, sleeping in their clothes, covers pulled tight. She moved from bed to bed, searching, and then she found him. Samuel. He slept on his side, facing the wall, one hand under his pillow. She stood beside his bunk and let herself just look at him. Her son. Alive. Here. Real. She touched his shoulder gently. He woke instantly, eyes flying open, and she pressed her hand over his mouth before he could make a sound. "Samuel," she whispered. "It's me. It's Mama." His eyes widened. She felt his body tense under her hand, ready to fight or run or scream. She kept her hand gentle but firm. "I got your phone call," she whispered. "I came back for you. We're leaving right now, but you have to be quiet." She lifted her hand slowly. He stared at her like she was a ghost. "You're alive," he whispered. "Yes. They said you died. They said you froze in the snow." "I know, I'm sorry, but I'm here now and we're leaving." "I can't." The words hit her like cold water. What? I can't leave. The prophet says. I don't care what the prophet says. He'll find us. He always finds people who leave. Let me worry about that. Samuel shook his head, and she saw tears glinting in his eyes. You don't understand. It's different now. He's different. After you left, he got paranoid. He thinks everyone's trying to betray him. If I leave, he'll punish the others. He'll hurt people. Samuel, he'll hurt Ruth. Becca's breath caught. Ruth helped you call me? She's the only one who was kind to me. The only one who said you weren't really dead. If we run, he'll know she helped. Then we take her too. You can't. She won't leave. She has nowhere to go. Footsteps outside the dormitory. Becca froze. Samuel's eyes went wide. They both listened as boots crunched on gravel coming closer. Get dressed, Becca whispered. Quickly. They're going to catch us. Then we fight. But I'm not leaving without you again. Samuel pulled on his shoes with shaking hands. Becca moved to the door and peered through the gap. Two guards outside now, flashlights swinging. They'd spotted something. Maybe the hole in the fence, maybe her truck on the ridge, maybe nothing at all, just routine paranoia. But they were coming this way. She pulled Samuel to the back of the dormitory, looking for another exit. There was a window high on the wall, big enough to squeeze through. She dragged a trunk under it and climbed up. The window was locked. Behind them, the front door handle rattled. Becca grabbed a book from the nearest bunk and smashed the window. Glass shattered, impossibly loud. She knocked out the remaining shards and grabbed Samuel, boosting him up. Go. Run for the fence. What about you? I'll be right behind you. The front door burst open. Flashlights flooded the dormitory. A voice shouted, Stop right there! Samuel scrambled through the window and dropped to the ground outside. Becca pulled herself up, feeling hands grab her ankle. She kicked backwards, connecting with something soft. The grip loosened. She pulled through the window and fell, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. Samuel pulled her up. This way! They ran. Behind them, alarms started blaring. Lights came on across the compound. Voices shouted, more footsteps running. Becca ran with her son's hand in hers, heading for the hole in the fence. 50 yards, 40, 30. A figure stepped out of the shadows ahead. Ruth. She looked at Becca with sad eyes. You came back. Come with us. I can't. Ruth, please. Go. I'll slow them down. Ruth pressed something into Becca's hand, a set of keys. My car's parked behind the security building, gray sedan. It's not much, but it's faster than running. Ruth, take care of him. Ruth looked at Samuel. Your mother never stopped loving you. Remember that. Then she turned and walked toward the approaching guards, calling out that she'd seen someone near the north fence. Becca ran with Samuel to the security building. The grey sedan sat exactly where Ruth said, old but functional. They jumped in. The engine started on the first try. Becca slammed it into gear and drove toward the main gate. The guards at the gate raised their flashlights, shouting for her to stop. She accelerated. One guard jumped aside. The other tried to stand his ground. At the last second, he dove away, and the sedan crashed through the wooden barrier, wood splintering across the hood. Then they were on the dirt road, headlights cutting through darkness, driving away from the compound as fast as the old car could manage. Becca looked in the rearview mirror. Lights were coming on everywhere, vehicles starting. They'd be followed within minutes. Hold on, she told Samuel. She pushed the sedan to its limit, rattling over the rough road, rocks pinging against the undercarriage. 5 miles, 10, 15. At the highway, she didn't slow down. She took the turn too fast and the sedan fishtailed, tires screaming. She corrected, accelerated, and merged onto the empty two-lane road heading north. Behind them, headlights appeared. "They're coming," Samuel said. "I know." She pressed the accelerator to the floor. The sedan shook, engine whining. 70 miles per hour. 80, 90. The headlights behind them grew brighter. Becca's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. She thought about the sheriff's card in her pocket. She thought about calling him for help, but they were still too far from Montana, too deep in the Prophet's territory. They had to make it to Redemption first. The town appeared ahead, buildings dark at midnight. She blew through the one traffic light and screeched to a stop in front of the sheriff's office. Empty. Of course it was empty. Redemption was too small to have a sheriff on duty at midnight. The headlights behind them were close now. Becca looked at Samuel. "Do you trust me?" "Yes." "Then get down and stay down." She drove behind the sheriff's office and parked in the shadows. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "911, what's your emergency?" "I'm at the sheriff's office in Redemption, Wyoming. Men are chasing us. They're from the cult compound 30 miles west. They've got guns. We need help." "Ma'am, slow down." "What compound?" "The Prophet's compound, the religious community. They're holding people against their will. I just escaped with my son. They're going to kill us if you don't send help." A pause. "Ma'am, stay on the line. I'm dispatching units now." 2 trucks roared into town, circling slowly, looking for them. Becca crouched in the sedan with Samuel, phone pressed to her ear. "They're here. 2 trucks. At least 4 men." "Help is coming, ma'am. Stay hidden." The trucks split up, searching the streets. One drove past the sheriff's office, so close Becca could see the faces inside. Young men, true believers, ready to drag her back to the Prophet for judgment. Sirens in the distance. The trucks heard them too. They stopped searching and idled in the middle of the street, engines rumbling. The sirens grew louder. The trucks suddenly accelerated, racing back out of town the way they'd come. 3 sheriff's vehicles appeared, lights flashing. They formed a roadblock at the edge of town, but the cult trucks were already gone. An hour later, Becca sat in the Redemption Sheriff's office with Samuel beside her, wrapped in a blanket. Sheriff Tom Garrett had driven from Montana after she'd called him. He sat across from her with a Wyoming state trooper, both listening to her story. "So you're saying the compound is holding people against their will?" the trooper asked. "Yes." "And you have evidence of this?" "I lived there for 13 years. "But you left voluntarily." "I escaped." "Did they try to stop you?" "No, it was winter. They expected the cold to kill me." The trooper wrote notes. "And your son? He's been living there since you left?" "The Prophet filed papers saying he was my son's legal guardian, claimed I was dead." "But you're not dead, obviously. So, this is a custody dispute." Becca's voice shook with frustration. "This is not a custody dispute. This is a cult that manipulates people, controls their lives, and traps their children in a cycle of abuse." "Have children been physically harmed?" "Not that I saw." "Sexual abuse?" "The Prophet marries girls at 16 to men in their 40s. That's legal in Wyoming if the parents consent." "The parents are manipulated into consenting." The trooper looked at her with tired eyes. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset. But unless we have evidence of actual crimes," Sheriff Garrett leaned forward, "what about the woman who helped them?" "Ruth. She's still in the compound. If they know she helped someone escape, she could be in danger." The trooper sighed. "I'll request a welfare check. But you know how these things go. They'll let us look around, show us happy people, and send us away." "So that's it?" Becca's voice cracked. "We just leave everyone else there. We follow the law." The trooper stood. You've got your son back. Be grateful for that. Most people who get out of these situations aren't so lucky. He left. Sheriff Garrett stayed. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? For how the system works, for how hard it is to fight something like this. Becca looked at Samuel, who'd fallen asleep in the blanket. What happens now? Now you take him home. You get him therapy. You build a new life together. Garrett reached across the table and squeezed her hand. And you hope that eventually more people get brave enough to leave. What about Ruth? I'll make some calls. Put pressure on the state to do a thorough welfare check. But beyond that, he shook his head. These places are hard to touch. They know their rights. They've got lawyers who make sure everything looks legitimate. It's not legitimate. I know. He's still hurting people. I know. And we're just going to let him? Garrett was quiet for a long moment. What do you want me to say, Becca? That I've got some magic solution? That I can ride in there and arrest everyone? I can't. The best I can do is make sure you and your son are safe. The best I can do is document everything you've told me and hope that someday it adds up to enough that the system finally acts. And in the meantime, you survive. You heal. You teach your son that there's a world beyond that compound. You show him what freedom actually looks like. Becca wiped her eyes. Is that enough? It has to be. They drove back to Montana in Sheriff Garrett's truck, Becca in the passenger seat, Samuel sleeping in the back. Dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The world looked clean in that light. New, like maybe hope was something real after all. You did good, Garrett said, getting him out. I left everyone else. You saved your son. That's what mothers do. Ruth saved us. I just drove. Ruth made her choice. She chose to help you. Don't diminish that by feeling guilty about it. Becca looked out the window at the passing landscape. Montana stretched wide and open, nothing like the tight confines of the compound. I need to find him a therapist, someone who understands this kind of trauma. I know someone in Billings. Good guy. Works with kids from all kinds of situations. How soon can we start? I'll call today. They drove in silence for a while. Then Becca said, Thank you. For what? For believing me. For helping without asking too many questions. I'm a sheriff. Asking questions is my job. You could have told me I was crazy. Could have said I was making trouble where there wasn't any. I've seen enough of the world to know that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like preachers and teachers and fathers. He glanced at her. You're not crazy. You're brave. Becca didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted and guilty and terrified about what came next. But she had her son in the back seat. She had a home waiting in Birch Falls. She had a chance to build something real. That would have to be enough. The house in Birch Falls looked exactly as she'd left it. Flowers in the garden, paint on the porch, the empty bedroom upstairs waiting. But now, it wouldn't be empty. She helped Samuel inside, showed him his room. He stood in the doorway and stared at the bed, the lamp, the window overlooking the mountains. You kept a room for me, he said. Of course I did. I thought you'd forgotten about me. Never. He sat on the bed, testing the mattress. It's soft. Is that okay? At the compound, we slept on thin mattresses. The prophet said comfort made you weak. The prophet was wrong about a lot of things. Samuel looked at her with eyes that seemed too old for 11. Are we safe here? Yes. How do you know? Because Sheriff Garrett is watching out for us, because the compound is 200 miles away, because I won't let anyone hurt you again. You couldn't stop them before. The words hit hard, but she didn't flinch. "You're right. I couldn't. But I never stopped trying, and now you're here, and I promise you, I will spend every day making up for the 3 years I wasn't there." He nodded slowly. Then, quietly, "I missed you." Becca crossed the room and pulled him into a hug. He stiffened at first, unaccustomed to affection, then gradually relaxed into it. She held him and felt him shake with silent sobs. 3 years of grief and confusion and pain, finally finding release. "I missed you too," she whispered, "every single day." They stayed like that until the tears stopped and the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Nancy called to ask if Becca was coming back to work at the diner. "Not today," Becca said. "I need a few days with my son." "Of course you do," Nancy said. "Take all the time you need. Your job's waiting when you're ready." That afternoon, Becca took Samuel to town. She showed him the diner where she worked, the library with more books than he'd ever seen, the park where kids his age played. He watched everything with wary eyes, like he expected danger to appear at any moment. At the grocery store, she told him to pick out anything he wanted. Anything. Anything. He walked the aisles slowly, studying the shelves like they held secrets. Finally, he picked up a box of cookies with chocolate chips. These? Perfect choice. At home, they sat on the porch and ate cookies straight from the box, watching the sun set over the mountains. Samuel didn't say much, but he sat close to her, and sometimes his shoulder touched hers, and that was enough. That night, after he'd gone to bed, Becca sat in her kitchen and called the therapist in Billings. They talked for an hour. She explained everything, the compound, the escape, the 3 years apart, the rescue. "It's going to be a long process," the therapist said. "He's going to have questions you can't answer. He's going to be angry sometimes. He's going to miss the community, even though they hurt him. That's normal. How do I help him? You be patient. You be consistent. You show him that the world outside the compound isn't dangerous and sinful. You show him that love doesn't require obedience. You show him that he's allowed to have opinions and make choices and be his own person. And if he wants to go back, then you remind him why he left. You remind him who he is without the prophet's voice in his head, and you trust that eventually he'll choose freedom." Becca hung up and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. She thought about Ruth, still in the compound. She thought about all the other children growing up behind those walls. She thought about the prophet, still preaching, still controlling, still building his kingdom on the backs of broken people. But she couldn't save everyone. She could only save the one person she'd brought into that world, and maybe that had to be enough. The weeks passed slowly, measured in small victories and setbacks. Samuel woke from nightmares 3 times a week, calling out for people whose names Becca didn't recognize. He flinched when she raised her voice, even in laughter. He asked permission for everything, to eat a second helping, to turn on the television, to go outside. "You don't need permission," she told him gently, over and over. "This is your home. You're allowed to just live." But unlearning a lifetime of control doesn't happen in weeks. It happens in years, in decades. In the quiet moments when you catch yourself about to ask permission and realize you don't have to anymore. The therapist in Billings was patient and kind. He let Samuel sit in silence for the first 3 sessions, just getting used to being in a room where he was allowed to say nothing. By the 4th session, Samuel spoke. "I'm angry at her." "At who?" the therapist asked. "My mom, for leaving me there." The therapist glanced at Becca, who sat outside in the waiting room. "Have you told her?" "No." "Why not?" "Because she came back for me. Because she risked her life. Because I'm supposed to be grateful." "You can be grateful and angry at the same time." Samuel looked up, surprised. I can? Of course. Feelings aren't rules. You're allowed to have all of them at once. That night, Samuel confronted her at the kitchen table. His voice shook, but he said the words, I'm angry you left me. Becca's heart broke, but she didn't look away. I know. You left me with them for 3 years. I did. I thought you were dead. I thought you didn't love me enough to stay. I loved you too much to stay. That place was killing both of us, Samuel, slowly. I had to leave to save myself so that someday I could come back and save you. But what if you hadn't come back? What if Ruth hadn't helped me call? I would have come anyway on your 12th birthday. That was always my plan. I was just waiting for the right time. You should have taken me when you left. You're right. I should have. She reached across the table, but didn't touch him, letting him decide if he wanted contact. I made a choice in the worst moment of my life, and it was the wrong choice. I will live with that guilt forever, but I'm here now, and I will never leave you again. Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. They sat like that in the kitchen, holding hands across the table, while the Montana night pressed against the windows and the house creaked around them. Sheriff Garrett called 2 weeks later with news about the welfare check. They went to the compound, he said. The state sent a team, social workers, a psychologist, 2 deputies. And the prophet gave them the full tour, showed them happy families, clean facilities, well-fed children. Everyone they interviewed said they were there voluntarily. What about Ruth? A pause. They couldn't find anyone by that name. Becca's blood went cold. What do you mean they couldn't find her? The prophet said no one named Ruth had ever lived at the compound. Said you must have been confused. She was there. She helped us escape. I believe you, Becca, but without evidence, without her coming forward herself, there's nothing we can do. Becca hung up and sat very still. Ruth had vanished. Either the prophet had hidden her or punished her or convinced her to deny her own existence. All 3 options ended in the same silence. She thought about driving back to Wyoming, thought about demanding answers, thought about breaking down those walls herself if she had to. But Samuel was upstairs, doing homework. Samuel was learning to laugh again. Samuel was building a life that didn't involve constant fear. She couldn't risk losing him again to save someone else. So she lived with one more guilt, one more name on the list of people she couldn't help. Ruth had given her son back to her. The least Becca could do was make sure that sacrifice meant something. By autumn, Samuel had enrolled in school. He struggled with the social aspects, making friends, understanding jokes, navigating the unspoken rules of 6th grade. But academically, he excelled. Years of scripture memorization had given him a sharp mind for retaining information. He devoured books from the library, reading about science and history and worlds beyond the one he'd known. He made one friend, a quiet boy named Marcus, who liked bugs and didn't ask too many questions about where Samuel had come from. They sat together at lunch and worked on projects about insects and talked about things that had nothing to do with cults or prophets or trauma. Becca watched from a distance, learning to let him have space. Learning that healing meant giving him room to become his own person, not the person the prophet wanted him to be, and not the person she wished she could have raised without the compound's shadow. One Saturday in October, Samuel asked if they could visit the mountains. They drove to a trail Sheriff Garrett had recommended and hiked through aspen groves turned gold by the season. The air was crisp and clean, the sky impossibly blue. Samuel walked ahead of her, sure-footed on the rocky path, and for the first time since they'd escaped, he looked like a child, just a boy hiking with his mother on a beautiful day. At the summit, they sat on a boulder and looked out over the valley below. Birch Falls was a tiny cluster of buildings in the distance. Beyond it, mountains stretched to the horizon. "It's big," Samuel said. "What is?" "The world. I forgot how big it was. You're allowed to go anywhere you want now." Anywhere in that whole big world. He thought about that for a while. Then, "I think I want to stay here for now." "That's okay too. But someday I want to leave. I want to see everything. I want to go to college and study something the prophet would hate." Becca smiled. "Like what?" "Evolution, or geology. Or maybe I'll just study how to help people leave cults. That would be a good thing to study. Do you think Ruth got out?" The question hung in the mountain air. Becca had thought about Ruth every day since the phone call from Sheriff Garrett, thought about her gray hair and sad eyes and the choice she'd made to help them escape. "I don't know," Becca said honestly. "But I hope so." What if she didn't? Then we remember her. We make sure her sacrifice mattered. We live the kind of lives she wanted for us, free and full and ours. Samuel nodded slowly. "I like that." They sat on the boulder until the sun started to sink and the temperature dropped. Then they hiked back down the mountain together, mother and son, learning how to be a family outside the walls that had defined them for so long. Winter came to Montana the way it always does, sudden and fierce and beautiful. Snow covered the farmhouse and the town and the mountains, turning the world into something clean and new. On Christmas morning, Becca woke to find Samuel already awake, sitting by the window watching the snow fall. "The prophet said Christmas was a pagan holiday," he said without turning around. "Said we shouldn't celebrate it." "Well, the prophet isn't here." "No, he's not." Samuel smiled, and it reached his eyes for the first time since they'd escaped. "Can we celebrate it anyway?" "We can celebrate anything we want." They spent the day making traditions of their own. Becca taught Samuel how to make pancakes from scratch. They watched movies and built a fire in the fireplace. They opened the small gifts she'd bought, books and warm socks and a compass, because Samuel had become fascinated with navigation, with knowing exactly where he was in the world at any given moment. That night, as they sat by the fire, Samuel asked the question she'd been waiting for. "Do you think I'll ever stop feeling like something's wrong with me?" Becca chose her words carefully. "I think someday you'll feel like what happened to you was wrong. But you're not wrong. You're exactly who you're supposed to be, and you're becoming more yourself every day. How long does that take? I don't know. I'm still figuring it out myself. You escaped 3 years before me. Escaping is the easy part. Learning how to live after, that's the work that takes a lifetime." Samuel stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I'm glad we're doing it together." "Me too." Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire crackled and popped. And two people who'd survived the same hell sat together in the warmth, building something that looked almost like peace. The compound still existed in the Wyoming wilderness. The prophet still preached to his followers. Children still grew up behind those walls, learning to obey and never question. Women still whispered doubts in the dark. Men still believed they were righteous. Becca couldn't change any of that, but she'd saved one person. She'd pulled her son out of the darkness and brought him into the light. She'd chosen him over her own safety, over her own fear, over everything else. And some mornings, when Samuel came downstairs smiling about something he'd learned or read or thought about, she believed that was enough. Not justice, not revenge, not even redemption. Just enough. Spring arrived slowly in Montana, melting the snow 1 inch at a time. The flowers Becca had planted 3 years ago pushed through the cold ground, stubborn and determined. Samuel helped her in the garden, learning the names of plants, understanding that growing things took time and patience and faith that something good was coming. Sheriff Garrett stopped by one afternoon with news. The FBI had opened an investigation into the compound. Someone else had escaped, a woman in her 20s who'd been born into the cult and finally found the courage to leave. She was talking, telling authorities everything. "It might not lead anywhere," Garrett warned. "These things take years, but at least someone's listening." "Is Ruth with her?" "I don't know. The woman wouldn't give names, said she was afraid of retaliation." Becca understood. Fear doesn't disappear just because you escape the thing you're afraid of. It lives in your bones. It colors every decision. It takes years to unlearn. But the fact that someone else had gotten out meant the walls were cracking, meant the prophet's control wasn't absolute, meant that maybe, eventually, the whole structure would collapse. She just had to be patient. She just had to keep living. She just had to show Samuel that the world beyond those walls was worth the fear it took to enter it. On the anniversary of their escape, Becca and Samuel drove to the ridge where she'd first watched the compound 3 years ago. The valley stretched below them, peaceful and remote. From this distance you couldn't see the control or the manipulation or the fear. You could only see buildings and gardens and people living their lives. But Becca knew the truth, and Samuel knew it too. "I don't miss it," Samuel said, standing beside her truck. "I thought I would, but I don't." "That's good. Do you think the others will get out?" "Some of them, not all, but some. And we'll be here when they do?" "Yes, we'll be here." They stood on the ridge as the sun set over Wyoming, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Then they got in the truck and drove north, back to Montana, back to the small town that had become home, back to the life they were building one careful day at a time. Behind them, the compound disappeared in the gathering darkness. Ahead, the road stretched wide and open, leading towards something that looked almost like freedom. And between the past and the future, a widow and her son drove in comfortable silence, survivors of the same war, learning how to live in peacetime. The prophet's voice no longer echoed in their heads. The walls no longer surrounded them. The fear no longer defined them. They were just two people driving home through the Montana night, ordinary and free, carrying their scars like proof that they'd survived something meant to break them. And they had not broken. They had bent. They had cracked. They had nearly shattered. But in the end, they had escaped, and that would have to be miracle enough.